Dean, if I want to know whether God exists, I have to deal with all these characteristics that he has, and he's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's all good. But when I start to try to harmonize all of these things, there's another characteristic sitting out here, which I'm told that God is completely free. He could have not made a universe, he could have done anything he wanted to. But when I have all these other things that he's supposed to be, it sounds like he's not really all that free.
There is a real tension here, because this set of characteristics, this batch, also contains things like perfect benevolence and moral perfections. So he's not going to make a bad choice, right? And then you try to say that this being is also free. Well, if there's a range of choices and some are better than others, could a perfectly benevolent being be free and choose anything less than the best for his world, for this world of creatures? So you're right. I mean, there's a real tension here, and it's particularly painful for some of us, like myself. I want to put a lot of weight on libertarian free will when I'm trying to explain why there's evil in the world.
That means people really have a choice to do one thing or another, and it's not constrained by God.
It's not constrained by God or my past history or anything. Right. And so there's an indeterministic fork in the road, and it's up to me which I take. And it wasn't good enough if God wanted moral freedom. It wasn't good enough that he just allowed me to choose between vanilla or chocolate ice cream or something like that. It had to be a choice between good and evil, right? And that allows for a kind of moral, for morally significant action and morally significant character traits to develop as I, with some grace thrown in there, choose more and more as I ought. Well, do we want to say that God started out with an option to choose between, a nasty, ugly world and a really nice world, and he could have done either one? That doesn't seem to be. That doesn't seem consistent with perfect benevolence. On the other hand, do we want to say he had a choice between a chocolate world and a vanilla world? Man, he chose one rather than the other. Well, that's freedom, but it isn't freedom to choose between good and evil. So there's a kind of...
It gets more complicated than that, though, because you can have good worlds, and then whatever makes that world good, you could always add more to it. So you can get better and better worlds almost without limit.
Right, and some philosophers have really pushed this as an argument against the existence of God. They've said, so I think it's very plausible to suppose that there are possible worlds, possible arrangements of things that God could have created better and better and better without limit, because he could have made more things and more good things and so on. And then they've wanted to say, if he chooses any one, he could have done better. If he could have done better, then there's a better possible being than God, and that's not on.
Well, I think what simplistically makes sense is that the argument doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. God may not exist, but this won't prove it. But what it does prove is that the constellation of characteristics that human beings have ascribed to God, all power, perfect benevolence, all kinds of perfections, morally perfect, omniscient, that constellation is somehow internally inconsistent. If you add freedom, that God has absolute perfect freedom to that.
Yeah.
That we've defined God's characteristics too perfectly.
I'm willing to give up the idea that God could have chosen, but could have made an evil choice. And say, look, that can't be in the constellation of attributes.
Okay, sure.
Right? I still want to keep freedom in there. So he could have made this world. He could have made that world. There were choices that could have been made that were all good, right? And so he was free to create them. And maybe not creating at all was a good choice. That was he could have done that. What I want to deny is that the existence of an infinity of better and better and better worlds shows that God couldn't be perfectly benevolent. And so the argument that goes, if he chooses world number 720 when he could have chosen world number 800, that shows that he's not as good as he could have been. I want to deny that. So I want to say, suppose you have a gambler who's a perfect gambler. When he knows what the odds are, he always bets accordingly. And for one race, one horse race, you give him any finite sum of money that he wants, and he can bet it. And then you have all the horses die except for one, right? So he knows with certainty which horse is going to win. Now, he could put any finite sum that he wants down. So he can put $100,000 down. Well, if he did that, he could have put more on, right? So he should have put $1 million on. Well, for any finite sum, you could criticize him. Right. And what I want to know is, does that show that there's no such thing as certainty? Does it show that there's no such thing as absolute certainty? I don't think so. I think the guy could be absolutely certain, and yet he still has to choose one of these. So certainty isn't perfectly reflected in the amount of money that you bet if you've got infinitely many choices. And I think that perfect benevolence is not perfectly mirrored in the quality of the world if there's infinitely many worlds.
Okay, but we're still wedded to these characteristics that we have ascribed to this perfect being. Is that part of the problem? These characteristics that we've ascribed to God, or are those characteristics necessary?
Well, so I'm thinking there isn't a problem here between, at least conceptually, between perfect benevolence, freedom to choose among a range of options, omniscience, omnipotence, and so on. I'm thinking that's a whole package that fits together fine. The problem with it is showing that that's consistent with evil. So I'm not seeing an incoherence in that package of ideas. Once we've taken away the idea that God could have chosen between good and evil, if we give that up, then I think it all hangs together.